sole contention is that a carbon tax would make America green again. As Alex Kerr of UC Davis explains, a carbon tax would create a price signal for private markets to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and invest in the development of fossil fuel alternatives like solar and wind energy. He furthers that these technologies would be uniquely attractive to businesses after a carbon tax because of their low production cost and stable prices, concluding that the tax would not only create a larger framework for creating and distributing clean tech, but would also invite business to invest in alternative energy with the guarantee of making a profit. Indeed, Sigmund Schmidt of the European Commission quantifies that a 1 percentage point increase in an energy tax's total share of user costs increases clean energy patents by as much as 2.4%. Consequently, Scott Nystrom of Synapse Energy Economics furthers that a carbon tax would result in significant turnover and replacement of many of today's traditional power plants with alternative energy power plants in the next 25 years. In fact, Nystrom finds that a carbon tax would increase wind and solar power's total share of U.S. power generation from 5 to 37%, a 640% increase. This shift has three key impacts. First, boosting the economy. The Union of Concerned Scientists finds that because it is far less mechanized and requires more human labor, producing just 25% of U.S. energy output through alternative energy would create triple the amount of jobs as producing an equivalent amount of energy through fossil fuels. Robert Poland of the Center for American Progress continues that just $150 million in new clean energy investment would create 2.5 million new jobs, enough to reduce the U.S. unemployment rate by a full percentage point. These job gains are essential because, as Aaron Shore of McGill University finds, unemployment by making access to basic needs far more elusive increases one's risk of death by 63%. Second, reducing U.S. foreign oil dependence. As Gregory Miller of the University of Oklahoma explains, the development of new technology is associated with a drastic drop in U.S. oil demand. Marshall Saunders of the Citizens Climate Lobby furthers that as alternative energy becomes competitive with fossil fuels, the United States will import less foreign oil, making America less dependent on nations and regimes that don't have our best interests at heart. This is crucial because, as Vicente Bove of the University of Waterloo finds, a 1 unit decrease in oil dependence decreases a nation's arms exports by 26%. The reason, as Bove furthers, is that oil-dependent nations like the United States are motivated to send weapons abroad by the potential for conflict to disrupt the supply of oil or increase in oil price. By limiting this dependence on carbon tax, will also limit the motivation for the United States to send military aid abroad. This is supremely important because military aid furthers terrorism. Naveen Bapat of UNC explains that nations receiving U.S. military aid are encouraged to further the prevalence of terrorist groups to keep the aid flowing. Consequently, he finds that by providing U.S. military aid to a nation, it lengthens the terrorist group's survival rate by 67%. Third, reducing air pollution. As the WHO reports, air pollution is the single biggest environmental health risk in the world. The reason, as Michelle Castillo of CBS News explains, is that exposure to air pollution for a prolonged period of time can raise the risk of lung disease and heart failure. Alarmingly, Bernie Roberts of the Earth Policy Institute reports that in the United States, air pollution claims 70,000 lives per year, a burden James Boyce of the University of Massachusetts explains disproportionately affects the poor and who are often forced to live in the shadow of dangerous factory fumes. Fortunately, as the Union of Concerned Scientists explains, shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy limits coal and natural gas emissions, which are directly linked to harmful air pollution. Consequently, Ian Perry of the IMF concludes that a carbon tax would result in a 23% drop in CO2 emissions and a 55% reduction in U.S. deaths from air pollution. Because we need a carbon tax to make America green again, Nathan and I are very proud to report.
Are you sure you don't need to write down that? Yeah, you should do that next time.
Everyone ready? We negate the topic. Our first contention is a global effort. David Krutzner of the Heritage Foundation reports a carbon tax would cut CO2 emissions by about 50% by 2030. These cuts translate to a temperature moderation of only 0.05 degrees centigrade. However, you would argue that this virtually immeasurable impact absorbed the millions of lost American jobs and trillions of dollars lost in income. The United States plays only a minor role in global carbon emissions, and as the Paris talks indicate, global warming needs a global solution. As the Tax Policy Center writes, a U.S. carbon tax will reduce the demand for domestic and imported fossil fuels. That demand reduction will drive down the worldwide prices of oil, coal, and fossil fuels, which would boost the fuel consumption in other countries. Eichner of the University of Hagan finds that leakage rates are expected to exceed 100% if the U.S. passed a carbon tax. Unfortunately, Orrin Koss of the Manhattan Institute explains, despite the notion of U.S. leadership in the form of a carbon tax as the linchpin for global action, as a preliminary matter, conceding in advance and arriving to the table without any bargaining chips is a very poor negotiating strategy. If one truly believed that a domestic carbon tax could serve as an instrument for fostering a global deal, its implementation should be suspended pending execution of a deal that met the desired parameters. Unfortunately, no such proposals are forthcoming. Ultimately, as carbon usage skyrockets globally, the U.S. loses its ability to foster an international coalition to combat climate change. Our second contention is entrenching big oil. The key to combating climate change in the long term is renewable energy. Faith B. Roll, executive director of the IEA, explains that 2/3 of the emissions causing climate change come from the energy sector. Without solving the problem in the energy sector, we have no chance to save the planet. Unfortunately, a carbon tax halts the movement towards green energy in two main ways, and the first is by diverting investment. Ben Eisner of the Fraser Institute explained that in the EU, the carbon tax has sent a powerful negative signal that has only weakened incentives for firms to invest in green energy. Ultimately, ABC Radio finds that the carbon tax may soak up surplus cash that could have been used by polluting industries to convert to cleaner alternatives. Ultimately, a carbon tax has stopped the transition to clean energy. David Levican of the Spectrum writes that Australia repealed its carbon tax because after its passage, the green sector faced the lowest rate of investment this century. And second is by entrenching natural gas. David Roberts of Fox News reports that while coal usage will suffer, oil will remain comparatively unaffected, so any carbon tax will only accelerate the ongoing shift from coal to natural gas. He continues that oil companies can live with a modest price increase on carbon for a very long time. However, coal as a commodity is at its tipping point, and a small carbon tax will push it over the edge. But as Joe Romm of Think Progress puts it, natural gas doesn't just displace coal, it also displaces nuclear power, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. Michael Levy of the Council for Foreign Relations explains that the shift to natural gas ensures a carbon lock-in. He writes that billions of dollars spent upfront on natural gas infrastructure will give gas an entrenched cost advantage over renewables. Once companies and communities have built businesses and livelihoods around natural gas, they'll use their clout to maintain the status quo. John Rogers, senior analyst at UCS, concedes that while natural gas may have been important in moving the country away from coal, substituting our dependence on one fossil fuel for another isn't going to pay off and poses major environmental problems in the long term. Romm furthers that increased natural gas will not substantially reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, but will instead delay the deployment of renewable energy technologies and in turn exacerbate the climate change problem in the long term. Darrell Banks at the Center for American Progress thus concludes that any long-term expansion and dependence on natural gas is incompatible with climate stabilization targets. Romm concludes, bottom line, natural gas speeds up global warming. It's for these reasons that we're very proud to engage. Over 100% once the United States passes a carbon tax, right? Yes. The Eichner evidence is based on ideas basically set forth by the Kyoto Protocol. Or absolutely not. It talks about when a country takes a unilateral action with a carbon tax, as would be the United States.
So why would there be leakages abroad?
It's very simple. So it's like supply and demand, right? So essentially there's the same supply of coal worldwide. But the thing is, demand goes down because the U.S. stops using as much carbon because they don't want to use it, which means prices go down internationally, which means people abroad are encouraged to use carbon.
330 million less consumers. So why would prices or why would production increase?
I'm not saying production increases. I'm saying there's a one-for-one trade-off because demand decreases, which means you're more likely to buy it if you're not in the United States.
If demand decreases, why do more people consume it?
Because of supply and demand, right? If demand goes down, prices have to go down to compensate. And when prices are lower, people are more likely to buy it.
Can I ask you a question? Demand goes down, therefore prices go down.
Yes.
That doesn't mean demand goes up.
Internationally, it goes up. In the United States, it goes down. In the United States, like you said, there's 300 million people. So to compensate, the industry is
In these countries that already have like these limited regulations, why don't they already increase production in the status quo?
Because it's expensive.
They want fossil fuels right now.
Because it costs money. Like we spent a minute now asking you question. So like, what drives market incentives? Or why does a company like choose to invest in something? Because it's cheap, right? Okay. So like, would a company rather invest in something like cheap or not cheap?
Something that's profitable. Okay. Yeah. So, in your second contention, warrant one about diverting investments, you tell us that a carbon tax would stop energy companies from investing in green technology, right? Yeah. So why aren't energy companies investing in green technology in status quo?
They are, and we're going to be green by like 2025.
So let's say that really we're going to be green by 2025.
Oh, maybe it's 2045, something like that.
So what percent of U.S. total generation will be green technology by 2040?
I'm not exactly sure. What do you mean?
Things like without a carbon tax. I just want to know how much we're stopping the acceleration of this trend towards green energy.
Oh, we're telling you the money instead, if you affirm the resolution, will be going to natural gas.
So what's an example of an energy company investing in?
We're running out of time, and there's a really important question.
I think there's a flaw in the argument, so I want to ask about it.
Okay,
sure. So how much investment is being diverted once you pass a carbon tax?
We're saying a lot because it's cheaper to invest in natural gas infrastructure than green energy infrastructure. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So the whole into your second impact about terrorism and stuff is really confusing. But you say 1 unit increase in carbon price decreases arms by 10%. That's a 1 unit increase.
No. Decrease in oil demand, which happens.
Wait, what's a 1 unit increase?
I don't know, 5 to 640% increase in the amount of renewable energy that the United States uses, which is what comes from Russia. That's I'm sure that's
So everybody ready? Alright. Let's go to their first contention when they talk about a global effort. Recognize that this argument is literally total nonsense. Remember what Sam tells you in Crossfire. It makes absolutely zero sense when you look to how supply and demand works that you would see a massive decrease in the people that want to consume oil and then internationally it would increase. That literally makes no sense economically. That's never going to be true. But second, there's going to be no impact to this entire contention because the International Energy Agency finds empirically the idea that a carbon cap in one country would cause a net increase in global emissions is contradicted by all quantitative studies. Maybe they can cherry pick one crazy author that tells you that leakage rates are higher than 100%, but when a vast majority of literature is telling you that is empirically false, they're always looking to the affirmative when it comes to their argument on leakage. But next, let's look at specifically a U.S. carbon tax that they never controlled for throughout this contention. Joshua Elliott of the University of Munich looks specifically at the U.S. and finds that total leakage would be 9% max, not even close to a net increase in global emissions, and clearly you're deferring affirmative on this argument. But let's go down to the second part of the argument, where they talk about a decrease in international cooperation. Recognize this is absolute nonsense as well, because the entire point that we don't see global cooperation in the status quo is because we don't have the biggest economy, the United States, on board. None of these countries can come together and solve the problem when the biggest economy, because they don't want to pass a carbon tax, is holding them back. At that point, look to Joshua Meltzer of Johns Hopkins, who explains that increasing U.S. demand for green tech would also create a strong global incentive for the development of new green tech in other countries. When we develop green tech, globally other countries want to compete, which means you turn the argument and you're seeing increased green tech all over the world. But second, you can turn the argument again because Alex Kerr of UC Davis explains that a carbon tax would restore the U.S.'s credibility in that global environmental discussion, meaning the U.S. would come to the international table with a new seriousness and focal point tantamount to mitigating climate change. Remember the words I read you, that the reason we don't see solvency of this right now is because the U.S. isn't committed. We need to show that the biggest economy in the world is actually willing to do something about this, and the only solvency for that in the round is going to be voting affirmative and passing a carbon tax. But let's go to their contention too, where they talk about oil. A lot of problems here. The first warrant they read is just a card saying that the EU didn't see increased green tech, or it sent a signal not to, right? First of all, the U.S. is uniquely reliant on fossil fuels. One, because we are very dependent on things like oil, and two, because we employ a ton of people in the fossil fuel industry. That means the U.S. uniquely is going to see an increase in green tech. But second, they don't warrant this in the slightest. It makes no sense why a carbon tax would decrease incentives for green taxes, green energy in the EU, make them provide you a warrant. But then they read this random trade-off evidence, right, that says that ABC says it would soak up cash for cleaner alternatives, right? There is literally no evidence saying that this money would otherwise go to cleaner alternatives, right? That makes literally zero sense. They need to access this, if they want to access this thing, they need to read evidence saying that the money we use for a carbon tax would otherwise be going to alternative energy, which they've never proved, and they definitely never warrant. But their first impact talks about the repeal of a carbon tax. This is going to be really problematic at the point where maybe Australia did it, but literally no other country that has a carbon tax has ever done so. Make them warrant why this would also happen in the U.S. when most countries aren't doing this in the slightest. But let's go down to their big impact on contention too, where they talk about natural gas. First, it makes no sense that we'd see a switch to natural gas because it still emits carbon and it's still going to be taxed. If I'm a company, I'm obviously going to go with a thing that has literally no taxes on it as opposed to something that does. But second, what Adam Brand of Stanford finds empirically is that even if you assume that all U.S. methane emissions are coming from natural gas industry, natural gas still isn't a bigger greenhouse gas contributor than coal. Meaning, if we switch to natural gas from coal, it's still a net benefit for the environment. But second, you can turn the argument against them because what Brand further is that switching from coal to natural gas for energy production still empirically reduces the greenhouse effect. At that point, you're not seeing any harm to natural gas. But the really big turn comes from Richard Pierce of George Washington University, who explains that a national switch from coal to natural gas would empirically reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% overall. Prefer this analysis to theirs because we're controlling for a U.S. switch, and that's why you're seeing decreased greenhouse gas emissions. But next, you turn the argument against them a third time because what Pierce furthers is the switch to natural gas would stop tens of thousands of premature deaths and hundreds of thousands of illnesses in the U.S. each year that are caused by uniquely fossil fuel particles. That's crucial because we're the only team linking straight through argument to actual death, which means you're always going to be voting affirmative because death is going to outweigh any other offense they read you. For these reasons, it's going to be a very clear affirmative ballot. Thank you.
In the status quo, there isn't enough green energy infrastructure in order to need to have a good profit to show at the end of the quarter. There's no infrastructure right now. They can't turn a profit in the short term, and that's what the CEOs look to. Then, on the impact level, they look into first they talk about the economy. First of all, their warrant is that it's more efficient. They give no reason why this would actually make more jobs. But even if you want to buy their jobs, in fact, we would say, at best for them, it's short term. It's about making the infrastructure. That's why you see more jobs in the short term. People need to build the things. But more importantly, let's go into their second impact. They talk, so at the end of the day, there's no impact. Now on to oil, a couple of colleagues. Cross-apply the Bloomberg analysis that by 2030, eventually what we're going to see is that we're actually going to be not oil dependent. That means they don't think into their arguments, but more importantly, even then I'd say they're really non-unique. They never meet their own bright line that Sam tells you in Crossfire is this 1% decrease in dependence. Other countries buy oil from the Middle East too. But we would say, at best, it's not really a big factor. The fact that we're probably bombing ISIS is a bigger factor than terrorism, not that we're trading oil. At the end of the day, this is really not an argument you should weigh that heavily. They read the Bob evidence, again, they never meet the bright line. Then they talk about pollution. The biggest misunderstanding they have right here is that they're not looking at the right comparative. We would say, looking to natural gas, that's what's having emissions. And we would say, in the long term, which is what Ron finds, is it's incompatible with climate change goals. That's a far greater consideration and has the greater scope in this round. But more importantly, they ignore the methane analysis that I read at the top of my rebuttal. But specifically, what we find is that methane kills people too. They want us to impact lives, but we would show you that methane kills far more, if not just as many lives, and the status quo. They don't impact to methane, so now we're in a front line. A couple things that they say in response. First of all, they misunderstand the supply and demand argument, specifically to domestic supply and demand and then international supply and demand. Specifically, developing countries want to have the most bang for the buck. They want to develop their economies. But then they say that there was a big contradiction with happening in the EU, and they made the wrong imperative. We would say specifically because we have like a shift to fossil fuel right now, and Ron finds that maybe we could have renewable energy in the long term by entrenching the infrastructure in the long term. What Levi finds is when you build all that infrastructure for natural gas, you can't shift to these renewable energies they want to impact to do. Then they say there's no warrant for the negative signals. We're talking about the private sector specifically. Maybe companies like ExxonMobil, seeing their long-term probability of having green energy, would invest, but in the short term they no longer have the capital to do so because they're paying this carbon tax. More importantly, they say that methane isn't really, in the overall natural gas is better, but we would say even if there's less emissions overall, methane rather is far, far more potent, so at the end of the day, it's a net ballot for the negative.
Okay, everybody good? Alright. So after a carbon tax, what percentage of national power will be from natural gas?
What do you mean by national power?
The power generation of the country.
Okay, so specifically, we're showing you, if you want to look to the long-term analysis, maybe we don't have all of our energy in natural gas, but it creates it so that we can't go to renewable energy in the long term.
Wait, one sec, let's back up.
Okay.
So, say only like 10% of the US becomes natural gas based after a carbon tax. Then can't the other 90% still shift to alternative
the issue
energy?
is specifically with the infrastructure. Ethan, I would argue, is probably a lot more than 10% because the comparative advantage applies exactly to natural gas,
And
right?
how much is it going to be?
I don't have an exact quantification. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, so like, what's the incentive of the CEO of a company? Like, what do they want to do at the end of the day?
Profit.
Right? In the long term or short term?
At all times.
Okay, so when I'm the CEO of a major company and I have a quarter meeting next month, do I want to show profits or falling profits?
I mean, I'd say like I'd be willing to like make my board members mad if I got a ton more money.
But like you get fired. Like,
Yeah, it depends on how things. This is kind of abstract. Like, what's your real question about?
No, that was my question.
Okay, can I ask a question then? Great. Let's talk about big oil for a second.
Sure.
So, can you explain to me, like, so the first warrant of big oil, that diversion. Like,
Sure.
why would a carbon tax send a signal to move away from
Okay,
big?
yeah. So basically, what we would say is there's like a limited amount of capital that like any company, let's say Exxon, for example, has right now, right?
Sure.
Okay, so the more of which they can spend on the carbon tax, the less of which they can spend on investment. And specifically in Australia, one of the reasons they repealed the carbon tax is because there was such low investment because of that.
Okay, so if we prove to you that you would be having a net profit by using alternative energy, doesn't that mean that you go like
If you
incur
could
those
prove
costs in the
that,
short term?
maybe, but we say we need to look to the short-term analysis. You don't like access any infrastructure. If you access infrastructure, you don't like access any of your impacts, right? You need infrastructure for green energy in order to.
I mean, yeah, I'd say we have. I mean, you yourself read us a uniqueness response saying we're building a ton now. So I'd say we have the infrastructure. Do you want to ask a question?
Sure.
Okay.
So like talking about this terrorism, right?
Yep.
The increase in terrorism.
Yep.
Is there like a really strong like strength of like here and no? Like are there a lot of other factors that contribute to it?
Contribute to what?
Like a rise in terrorism?
I mean, we're showing you. I'm sure there's other
Like
things.
why
that
is this
cause
a big
terrorism.
factor we should weigh in around?
Okay, because we tell you that. I mean, we give you a pretty clean link chain, right? We say
No,
decrease.
I understand your link chain. I
Yeah.
respond to that rebuttal. I'm saying like how big is the impact? Like what is the magnitude of this
The
leverage?
impact is you stop increasing the length of terrorist survival by 67%, which is what a pot does.
Right, but is that like in a vacuum, or are you like taking into account like literally every other factor that like affects a terrorist
I
organization?
mean, maybe like other factors to cause it
I'm
to
saying,
increase.
why is this the most important factor?
I'm just, all the argument is like, even if other factors cause it to increase, it would have increased higher if we hadn't passed the
Like, why
carbon
is
tax.
this, like, if there's like, if like the scope of its impact isn't that big, it's just like having.
I mean, it's pretty big considering we give military aid to countries all over the world. Alright, yeah, sure. So talking about the global impact, right?
Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about this like Germany-China example. Is it hard to say the reason emissions tripled to China was because of Germany?
It says that the emissions went down and they went up because they saw that there was like a price demand signal, there was lower
Okay,
prices in
so
Germany.
it says because in Germany it went down, that's why it went up in China. Okay.
So you guys think you got-
Yes.
Charlotte Nico with Caroline overview and rebuttal. She tells you that when Germany decreases emissions went up in China. There's absolutely no causal link between the two. But secondly, they tell you that methane kills 400,000 people. Methane is only released in the extraction of natural gas, not in the combustion of it. Natural gas doesn't release a lot of methane. It's other factors contributing to this increase in methane. It's not natural gas. With that, go to their first contention, where they talk about leakage. Essentially, first, the IEA tells you that there's no quantitative studies saying that there will be an increase in carbon leakage after you pass a carbon tax. But specifically, when you look to the United States, Elliott tells you total leakage from a United States carbon tax will only be 9%, essentially saying you're still reducing emissions. With that, go to their second contention, their second one about natural gas. Remember the two terms we put in their contention. We tell you a switch to natural gas wouldn't actually be that bad. First, Pierce tells you that a switch from coal to natural gas throughout the United States would decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, not carbon, but greenhouse gas. But secondly, Pierce tells you that that switch would actually save tens of thousands of lives. With that go to our case about making America green again, we tell you would see 4 times more green investment in the status quo without a carbon tax. Nystrom tells you that a carbon tax would actually increase green tech investment by 6.4 times as much, but that's more than 4 times. But secondly, because we don't have the infrastructure for green technology, Kerr tells you that a carbon tax makes investing in alternative energy more profitable to the point where we're going to be seeing this infrastructure investment. With that, go to the cleanest way you can vote for us, which is on this idea of air pollution. They tell you to look to natural gas. We term this 2 times by telling you that natural gas would actually save lives. But even if you believe that we would be switching to alternative energy, Perry tells you that a carbon tax would lead to a 23% reduction in CO2 emissions and a 55% reduction in U.S. deaths from air pollution. At the end of the round, we're clearly outweighing because we're the only ones directly impacting to saving lives. We tell you we save lives with natural gas if you switch to natural gas. And we also tell you we save tens of thousands of lives if we switch to alternative energy. In both worlds, we're winning the debate.
Remember the overview, the first way we can win is bargain. We give you the leakage argument with the supply and demand war. First they come up here and we do the evidence that we're worried about 9%. What we call the evidence, it says the leakage from the electricity sector would be 9%. Obviously it sounds really good, but you're not looking at actual total emissions. We tell you it's a 1-for-1 trade-off when you look to actual all emissions. But then they say, like we give you the non-unique response, that we're going to increase our investment by 4 times by 2030. They say it's going to go up by 6.4%. So really that's not like on the probability arc, like that we're going to switch to natural gas. It's better, like that's not a reason to vote for them because it's not like a significant increase. That's also assuming the money doesn't go to natural gas and they don't even respond on the link level and summary. So if we win that link, we win the round. Let's talk about that link. That's on our second contention. We say that the private sector has the investment to invest in the best option. And in the short term, that is natural gas. And that's really damning for them because we say that entrenches it in the long term. Because once you spend billions of dollars on infrastructure for natural gas, you're not going to spend billions of dollars on infrastructure in green tech. At that point, you're already signing a negative ballot. But then let's talk about, they respond to the Australia evidence by saying it's the only place that happened. It's the most recent place that's happened. We also tell you investment was totally halted. They don't give you any alternate examples. We tell you it was actually stopped. But then they say that it still emits carbon. But the reason why we switched to natural gas is because it's cheaper to invest in it than green tech, and it's still on net better for the companies to invest in that than to invest in green tech. At that point, we're winning the link in the second way. You're signing your ballot there. But then they give you deterrents. Group them because they're all talking about decreasing emissions. The problem is you decrease emissions on net, but methane is 20 times more potent than carbon. So when you increase methane by fracking, that means we outweigh because they're 25 times more potent. We're killing more people. They never respond to the overview that Caroline gives you on methane, which is where you're going to be voting for us, which says that A, it's the tipping point for climate change. It's really important to vote off that. But second, if we don't reduce methane emissions by 20%, 400,000 people's lives are going to die. At the point, it's completely unresponded to. You can vote for us on live. They never respond to that. But remember, the most important thing to remember is once we invest in the infrastructure for natural gas, we're not going to invest in the infrastructure for the green tech. And even if you don't buy that, going from 4 times the increase in investment to a 6 times increase in investment isn't enough of a chance to take by affirming the resolution. We're very proud to negate.
Yeah, we should go up there. Does electricity generation make up a majority of this country's fossil fuel production?
Maybe our country, but not China's.
Okay, great. Yes.
Okay, so talking about the long term, right? So there's no infrastructure in the short term for green energy, and we can't have any in the long term. How are we going to implement all of this green energy, even if there's a lot of research?
Okay, 2 problems, right? First of all, you can see that we have the infrastructure now. At the point where you read me a uniqueness response and rebuttal,
No, we say we're going to get the infrastructure by 2030.
Okay, great. We get it by
And we show
2030.
you
We link it.
specifically what Ron says, when you tax carbon, you displace that infrastructure with natural gas infrastructure.
Wait. Let's back up for a second. So, say I'm a gas company, right? What's cheaper? To go with the natural gas, which I still tax, or to go to something that has no production
2 problems with this. First of all, there's already enough infrastructure in the status quo to start up the natural gas, and comparatively to coal, it's not taxed a lot. And we would say it's a lot more expensive to build all of the green infrastructure than to just use a little bit to build some of the natural gas infrastructure and then make your profits rather easily.
You want to ask a question?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, the first thing I asked in first crossfire, would a company rather invest in something that's cheap or something that's not cheap? Whatever makes them a bigger profit.
Right? And the problem
Okay, but
let's back up a second. Very annoying line of question. So let's clarify. The current analysis that we read at the top of our case is crucial here. Because you're not reading me any of it. You're saying companies now profit from natural gas. We read you evidence that literally says, after a carbon tax, one sec, it reads, okay, because it's still taxed, right? We read you evidence that say it's
That's the Roberts part.
okay, one sec. We read you evidence at the top of the case saying after a carbon tax, companies have a promise of making profits with alternative energy.
That's assuming they have access to infrastructure,
They
which
still
you don't have access to.
Because the investment inspires the
No,
infrastructure.
you tell me there's investment in technology. That's not the infrastructure. It's like researching how to
In
power
order
the
to
sun.
invest in something, we need to be able to scale it
Stop
up.
drills in, right? We're not just
I mean,
researching.
your LinkedIn is a 1% increase in investment means 2.4 times more
Okay,
percent more patents.
Right,
What
that's
actually
that's
doing
one
the
of
real
our
work.
links. The other link in is the Nystrom analysis, which you misunderstand. You think it was 6.4% increase in alternative energy? It was actually 640%. Sam said 6.4 times more. So the reason that's really crucial is because 2 things. First, it links back into my question in the second cross, where I asked you how much of actual national gas generation is going to come from natural gas, right?
Let's say a majority, and that's the box evidence tell you that.
I mean, it's not going to be more than
It just says it
640.
accelerates a trend. It doesn't say that it actually.
Yeah.
You say it's a 6.4 times larger increase in investment, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we tell you it's going to be 4 times.
It's not investment.
It's
Sorry.
total share of U.S. power
Yeah,
generation.
specifically, it's if you move alternative energy, what nicely says, from 5% of national generation to 37%. And look, if you can give me a competing empiric saying natural gas is more, then maybe you can outweigh. But we're the only team.
Okay, so you can give us the empiric, but you have to win the link level debate to get that
The other
empiric.
problem is
Okay, so we get the empiric if we win the legal.
Yes,
Okay.
I'll concede that if you win the debate, you win the debate.
Everybody ready? First voter's natural natural gas. What Sam tells you in summary is that they misunderstand how methane is related to natural gas. Natural gas only releases methane in the production stage, and it releases a very tiny amount of methane. So the link that they are making is that natural gas leads to methane, we don't know how much, and they're saying methane kills a lot of people. At that point, you cleanly extend the Pierce analysis, which makes the direct link for you, where we tell you that natural gas empirically saves tens of thousands of lives by forcing the industry away from fossil fuels. We are outlaying on face right there because our link is much stronger. Remember, the reason there is a disparity in between these two pieces of evidence is because natural gas barely creates any methane, right? So when you massively increase natural gas and get rid of coal, which creates a lot of greenhouse gases, Pierce still finds that moving from coal to natural gas decreases global national greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. It's going to include methane. Remember, we are giving you the cleanest link on natural gas. It's a very clear affirmative ballot. Do not let them respond to these terms in final focus. They're clearly extended, and they drop the analysis on methane. With that, let's go to the other very clean voter, which is going to be alternative energy. First, they make this big response where they talk about how infrastructure is a problem. We respond to this in two ways. First, we tell you they read you a uniqueness response that we're developing these things now, meaning we have the infrastructure. Second, Sam tells you in summary, and we repeat like over and over in the Grand Cross, that when you invest, you literally create that infrastructure. This is where the Kerr analysis comes in. He tells you that when you have a carbon tax, like companies have a promise of making a profit with green tech, which is why they invest in infrastructure. They lose the round when they drop the Nystrom analysis, telling you that global power, national power generation from green tech increases from 5% to 37%, which is a 640% increase, outweighing the non-existent empiric they give you about natural gas's share of generation. At the end of the day, the biggest impact is going to be Kerry, where he tells you empirically that a carbon tax reduces national deaths from air pollution by 55%. This outweighs any piece of offense they extend because it links directly into lives. They don't do that anywhere in the case. And remember, don't give them a link from methane to lives and from natural gas to methane. Barely any methane is emitted, which is why you go with Pierce, who makes the direct link for you. For these reasons, it's a very clear affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Yeah.
But rather, we would say that fracking absolutely releases a lot of methane into the atmosphere, but specifically, he misunderstands its evidence. It says we need to reverse the trend by 20% in order to save 400,000 lives. Even if it's not releasing a lot of methane, they definitely don't reduce the trend. They never materialize the impact. So at best for them, lives are a wash. Let's go to the far bigger consideration in today's round, which is overall environmental policy. They have a misunderstanding of what our non-uniqueness card says. It says, by 2030, we'll have enough green infrastructure, but wrong, who they don't respond to specifically finds is that when you tax carbon, because of the comparative price decreases, where coal being a literal hunk of carbon is taxed more than natural gas, they find that it doesn't just displace coal, but instead it displaces the renewable energy that they tell you is so great. Moreover, they don't look at this in a realistic analysis, they only look at it in a vacuum. Right now, there isn't the infrastructure, so all this green investment they're talking about has literally nowhere to go. But more importantly, let's talk about the long-term analysis. They never respond to Levi, who says, in the short term, when we invest in this natural gas, we can't go out, we're stuck in a carbon lock-in. The reason this is really problematic is all of their green energy, because we don't have the infrastructure right now, is inherently long-term. The reason that's problematic for their offense is they literally don't link into any of their carbon anymore, because they have no offense coming off of the carbon. So at the end of the day, a couple ways in which you weigh this. We would say, one, you weigh the environmental policy above all. The reason that's really critical is specifically, like Ethan tells you in summary, is methane is more potent. Ethan does respond to the terms, they're all about CO2 emissions. Even if you buy that overall CO2 goes down, we would say methane is far, far more potent. So even if overall a little bit less is being emitted, we would say it's more potent. Not only does that kill lives, but specifically, we show you that it accelerates climate change at a far greater rate. So we would say, weigh the environment above the lives, because the best is to watch for them, and specifically the unique harm from a carbon tax comes from locking in the natural gas infrastructure, which means we don't have any access to their impact in the long term. For those reasons, we're incredibly